Good afternoon. This is Tessin Muzaffar, and I was asked to give a talk on the emerging gene therapies in neuromuscular disorders. And I really wanted to use this time to go over what has been the current experience. And as we are going to be seeing more and more gene therapies for rare disorders, what are the challenges that we are facing, especially in relation to gene therapy? I'm a professor in the Department of Neurology at University of California, Irvine, also direct the neuromuscular division here. The gene therapies have been in existence for the last 4 years, and there is currently one gene therapy that is approved by the Federal Drug Administration in the US for a eye disorder. And then they will, and also for spinal muscular atrophy. Now, this is a potential treatment for various diseases, especially monogenic diseases. They are designed to deliver functional genetic material into the cells to treat the disease. And it's particularly good for monogenic inherited disorders, but we are seeing a lot of cancer-related as well as acquired disease-related gene therapy, especially with diseases like inclusion body myositis, where there is strategies to downregulate some of the muscle atrophy genes. The material is used with a vector, and the purpose of the vector is to get it transported into the cell, where it unloads is the genetic material, and the cells are now containing the gene therapy in a gene therapy construct like that. So the approach that is selected for gene therapy depends on really the underlying condition or its cause. So in certain conditions, you want to replace a defective gene. So for instance, in the case of hemophilia or Pompe disease, you want to do a gene transfer. But there are strategies that will allow for gene inactivation. And then there's strategies that will allow for gene editing and correction of the mutation as well. Those are usually done as in vivo approach. So they are done outside the human body and then transferred into the human body. But the gene transfer involves the delivery of a functional copy of an existing gene to restore or enhance normal function. So if, again, in a situation where there is no or reduced production of functional protein, you can deliver the correct copy of the gene to allow for a improved production of the product, and thus now restores the function of the cell. It is particularly attractive for loss of function pathogenic variants, and one highlight a gene therapy that I would highlight are gene therapies for lysosomal storage disorders, which is my particular area of interest. And we've been spending a lot of time on this lately. It's in this particular case, you are not fixing the gene defect. You are just providing a functional copy that is there and produces the protein that is missing. Now, gene activation is usually done with the objective to block the expression of harmful genes, and this is through negative regulation. So in this particular scenario, you have a cell that's producing excessive amount of protein. You put in a siRNA construct or a RNA interference construct, and they will go in and silence the expression of this protein, and you result in protein production, which is normal. This is, again, appropriate for gain of function or dominant mutations, or also single nucleotide pathogenic variants and insertion and deletions. So Huntington's disease and Duchenne muscular dystrophy are perfect examples where you can silence the production of the Huntington's gene product, or you can overcome the splice site abnormalities that an insertion or a deletion may create, such in the case of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It may still require the functional protein, and even the reduced amount of protein that you are producing may still be functional in this situation. And then the third example is gene editing, which is being used more and more. In this case, the cell has a mutated gene sequence resulting in the genetic dysfunction. You go after the target RNA and you provide a guide RNA, and usually these are CRISPR-Cas9 based technologies, and they will splice out or cut out the mutant DNA and reformulate the DNA, and that results in proper functioning of the cell. And again, one good example there is sickle cell disease, where this is being tried out. It is a tailored approach. It is a personalized medicine. It tends to be far more expensive because this one size does not fit all in this. In the way of administration also differs. So either you can have in vivo or ex vivo strategies. In vivo strategies, you can have vector administered directly into the body. And in an ex vivo situation, your cells are removed from the body, they are transduced and returned to the body, and then they will hopefully replace the dysfunctional protein. Genetic material, the expression of this requires a cassette, which consists of regulatory elements and gene of interest. So the expression cassette is attached to the viral genome. The vector is the delivery vehicle, which is usually the common adeno-associated virus, which is a common cold virus, but it could be a lentivirus in this case. Then you have the recombinant vector capsid, which goes in. The viral genome has been modified to remove viral DNA. It lacks replication potential, so therefore it is non-pathogenic. It is designed for efficient cellular entry and transit to the nucleus. And there are different viral vectors with tissue specificity, different tissue specificity that can be used for investigational gene therapy. So the more common viruses that are being used currently are adenovirus, lentivirus, as well as adeno-associated virus. The viral vectors can be integrating or non-integrating. So the viral vectors, usually the viral genome has been modified to remove the viral DNA. They do not, are not able to replicate. They're non-pathogenic. They do allow efficient entry. But most of these viral vectors, especially the adeno-associated virus and adenovirus, are non-integrating. They don't become permanent part of the genome. Whereas lentivirus, for instance, is an integrating virus where it becomes of the genome, as highlighted here by the green bar, and they will permanently remain part of the DNA. And thus there is a potential of them going mutant and becoming propagating or pathogenic. So the properties of a wild type AAV vector is what it makes it most attractive for gene therapies these days. These are most commonly used viruses in gene therapy development. They have a small non-enveloped capsid. They're non-pathogenic. They have low immunogenicity. They can carry a load or a transgene of up to 5 kilobases in length, and the genetic material very rarely integrates it into the host genome. And there are large number of naturally occurring xenotypes, and each of these serotypes has a different specificity for tissue type. So for instance, AAV9 has a much higher tendency to go to the muscle. Most of the adenovirus will go to the liver as a natural host. Before modification is required for the investigational gene therapy, the viral DNA consists of linear single standard coding region, and they usually have 2 open reading frames in the center. And then they have a double standard inverted terminal repeat region on each end. Now, the expression cassette designed for an investigational AAV gene therapy would include an expression cassette, and an expression cassette would contain the functional copy of the therapeutic gene, which is of the therapeutic gene of interest, and it's otherwise known as transgene, and the regulatory elements for tissue organ of interest. For instance, if you want to target muscle tissue, you want to probably put in either a desmin or a creatine kinase promoter, so it can be specifically expressed in the muscle tissue. Your ITRs are required for packaging into the recombinant viral vector. So the viral vectors, AV vectors, can be bioengineered to target a specific tissue or cell type. So again, it partly depends on the viral capsid serotype, as I mentioned. AAV9, for instance, has a natural tendency to go to muscle, but most of the AAV goes to the liver. And you can also put in a tissue-specific promoter. So if you're going after the heart, you may want to put a heart-specific promoter. If you're going after skeletal muscle, you usually use a CK or a desmin promoter. Similarly, other tissues can be engineered that way. So that way, if you have a liver-specific serotype, it goes to the liver primarily and not have expression elsewhere. If you have a CNS-specific serotype, it goes specifically to CNS. And if you have a lung-specific serotype, you can go specific to the lung. Now, there are 13 naturally occurring serotypes in AAV with varied tissue specificity. Right now, the strategy that's being used in Pompe disease, where there are 6 ongoing gene therapy trials in the US, it's mainly liver and muscle, and there is a program that also is looking at CNS-directed approach. So AAV1 has a natural tropism to the neurons, heart, some skeletal muscle. AAV3 is primarily liver. AAV8 is liver, heart, and neurons. AAV9, as I mentioned, is another one that's being used. It's mainly liver, lungs, and skeletal muscle. But you can modify this with attaching a specific tissue promoter in there. So the key takeaway that I want you to take away from the first part of this talk is these gene therapies are now a reality. They are no longer a matter of fiction. There are different strategies such as gene transfer, gene inactivation, and gene editing that are currently being investigated for monogenic diseases. The investigational gene therapy consists of genetic material that is delivered through a vector, most commonly a virus such as AAV, but you can use lentivirus and adenovirus. And AAV vectors can be selected for specific tropism to tissues affected by the disease through selection of the viral capsid serotype or a tissue-specific phenotype. Now, I want to briefly mention a few of the disease processes where gene therapy is being used. I'm going to start with the example of spinal muscular atrophy, where the gene therapy was shown to be very effective and was approved for use in patients with spinal muscular atrophy. But then I also want to talk about some of the strategies that were taken in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and spend a little bit more time on Pompe disease, which again, as I mentioned, is where I spend most of my time, and it's a very unique disorder. So this is a table that I borrowed from Megan Waldrop's review. This is talking about the different therapies available for spinal muscular atrophy, as well as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. In spinal muscular atrophy, there is nusinersen, which is approved. This is a antisense oligonucleotide, RNA interference strategy. The Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy. This is an adeno-associated virus gene replacement. And the more recent oral agent, which is a splicer modifier of SMN2 in spinal muscular atrophy. The modes of administration is intrathecal for nusinersen, intravenous for the gene replacement, and daily oral for the risdiplam, which is a Roche agent. There are limitations as to who you can use this. FDA gave a broad label for nusinersen, whereas the gene therapy is only approved for less than 2 years old. And risdiplam is approved for anyone above the age of 2. In Duchenne, corticosteroid still remains the main drug, which slows down the time to get into a wheelchair, prevents the scoliosis. But you have different genetic modifications approved now. Exondys 551 was the first one. You have Vyondys 53, And then you have other antisense approaches that are approved as well. Atalorin is only approved in Europe. This is a stop, go down, read through strategy. And this one is not currently approved in the US thing. This is some of the data from the nusinersen. Again, just as a reminder for those who are not familiar with spinal muscular atrophy, infantile spinal muscular atrophy is a fatal disease. These children never sit up, they never walk, they're not able to feed themselves, and they're respirator dependent. And this drug was shown to be highly effective by means of prolonging survival. So they had event-free survival compared to control patients. And they had a less dependence on ventilator. So these kids managed to live a year without respirator, which is a remarkable result on that. This is the score, and you can see the nusinersen patients versus the control patients. And during the period of treatment, the Hammersmith score, which is the standard score used in spinal muscular atrophy, improved in patients with spinal muscular atrophy. The natural tendency for Hammersmith is to go down in patients, as you can see in the control patient. And then a number of these patients were able to survive without permanent ventilation, which is almost unheard of in a SMA patient. As you can see in the control patient, almost all of them required permanent ventilation. Now, this is nusinersen data in the late onset spinal muscular atrophy. So these are not type 1 patients. These are type 2 and some type 3 patients. These patients, some of them may be able to sit, but some of them are not able to walk. Some of them are able to walk. This is a much more severe phenotype compared to the late onset SMA in adult, which you can usually walk, but this is a milder phenotype compared to type 1. And you can see that there's a clear separation between the treated patient versus the control patient. If you look at the Hammersmith score, as well as the upper limb measures, and they were shown to be superior and significantly better in the nusinersen arm. Similarly, if you look at change from the baseline, the patients with treatment or nusinersen treatment were improving, whereas patients with the control group were getting worse from treatment. And this led to the approval of nusinersen in all forms of SMA in the US. Now, the gene therapy was even more impressive, and this is now going out to 30 months. And you can see that in the first set of patients that were treated, they were their CHOP INTEND score, which is another measure of motor function in spinal muscular atrophy, was stable and improving. And when you look at this cohort 2 of the patients who were given a higher dose of the gene therapy, there was a remarkable improvement. 40 is what is the ceiling for CHOP INTEND. This is anything above 40 is completely normal, and compared to a age-matched child. And you can see that except for one patient who for some reason did not improve and he was treated a little late in the game, your cohort 2, all of them reached normal normal CHOP INTEND score, which is a striking result. And this is for the first time. These are kids are talking, they are eating on their own, they are ventilator free, and they are very communicative. It's a really great study on that. And this is individual patient score, and you can see that these patients now are able to control the head. Just to remind you, these are type 1 SMA. Type 1 SMA never are able to hold their head up. They're not able to sit down without assistance. They cannot speak or swallow, and they cannot go without ventilators. And majority of these patients were able to speak, they were able to swallow, they were able to sit unassisted. And some of them actually started walking and able to run. And they don't require G-tube, they don't require a ventilator. So this is currently the criteria for gene therapy. If you have a newborn who's suspected of SMA type 1 and has been confirmed on genetic testing to have 5q SMA, then, and especially if they're under 2 years of age, they would be screened for SMA gene therapy. If they are not less than 2 years of age, then they are not a candidate for gene therapy. They would be considered for nusinersen or risdiplam. But for gene therapy, they have to have low AAV9 antibody titers. They cannot have major abnormalities on liver function, platelets, or troponin 1. They can't have active infection, and they cannot have any severe disease as part of it. Okay. I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about lysosomal storage disorders, which are inherited monogenic disorders. They are caused by deficient levels of functional lysosomal associated proteins. And one good example of that is Pompe disease, otherwise known as acid maltase disease or glycogen storage type 3, which is a lysosomal storage disorder caused by loss of function pathogenic variants in the acid alpha glucosidase gene. It is inherited in an autosomal recessive function. And the mechanism is the same. You have lysosomal uptake of compounds that are to be metabolized, degraded. There's a deficient functional enzyme or transporter. And as a result, you have progressive accumulation of compounds or metabolites within the lysosomes, ultimately resulting in rupture of the lysosomes and cell death. So gene therapy is one of the approaches that is being used. There are enzyme replacement therapies already approved, but they're only effective to a certain extent. So there is an unmet need that may prompt gene therapy. It is being investigated right now to determine their impact on levels of functional enzyme in target tissues, being heart and muscle. And it is still under subject to clinical investigation, and we have not concluded the studies yet, so we cannot comment anything about the effectiveness as well as safety. But the purpose here is to show you what the potential strategies are. Now, as I mentioned, there are at least 6 companies that are pursuing gene therapy in Pompe disease. Actus is the furthest along. They already have dosed their patients, and these patients are in follow-up. They managed to dose 8 patients. And they're using a combination of AAV2, AAV8 serotype. The transgene that they're carrying is GAA. They're targeting a liver strategy, which the purpose there is to create a liver depot, and it's a phase 1, phase 2 study. Spark, which I am the principal investigator for, it's a secretable GA, again, another AAV strategy on AAV8 background. Again, the strategy is to create a liver depot and to produce the secretable GA within the liver, which is immunologically privileged. And again, it's a phase 1, 2. And Odentis is another AAV8. This one is a GA as well, but this is going to be targeted to go into the muscle and locally produce muscle GA. Now, there are other strategies being developed right now. The furthest along out of that is the AVRIA-BIO study, which is using a lentivirus, which I mentioned is a permanently integrating gene. And they're using a GILTAC, which is often linked to IGF-2 signaling. And so this is an ex vivo strategy. They will take patients, they will do a leukapheresis on the patient, isolate the human stem cells. They will correct the gene. They will insert the lentivirus in there, and then they will reinfuse it back into the human patients as well. So in the liver-directed strategy, because AAV virus has a natural tendency to go to the liver, it is an ideal virus for that. It is delivered systemically via IV infusion. The virus has natural tropism to the liver. It's a liver-specific promoter with the objective of expressing GA specifically in the hemocyte. So the transgene is packaged into an AAV. It's delivered by infusion, and it's delivered to the nucleus of the liver cell. And there it creates an episome and starts producing the therapeutic transgene. So the idea here is to create a depot in the liver. The hepatocytes will start secreting GA enzyme into the bloodstream. And this GA enzyme is then taken into the targeted tissue, which may be skeletal, cardiac, muscle, through a mannose-6-phosphate receptor-mediated uptake. And once they're inside the cell, the GA enzyme is processed further to fully become functional to clear glycogen. Now, it's a single administration. It's going to being given a one time. And one of the strategies that we are looking for is to prevent this from happening. So currently, when the enzyme replacement is given, the infusions are given every 2 weeks, and you get a peak high level of the enzyme, which trails off over the next 2 weeks, and the patient goes with subtherapeutic levels in the enzyme till they get the next infusion. And if they happen to miss a dose or two, they will be missing enzyme quite significantly. In the idea with the gene therapy is you give the gene therapy once it incorporates itself into the liver hepatocytes, you get a steady supply of the enzyme on a daily basis without any wild fluctuations in the peak and trough, and that would result in better delivery of the enzyme to the cells. And this has been shown in animal models that there is effective. Also, the one advantage of liver-driven GAA is the liver is immunologically tolerant to transgene products. So anything that is produced in the liver is immunologically privileged. And as you can see from this graph, the AAV produced human GAA did not produce any anti-GAA antibodies. Okay, this is again being looked at, and there is a study going on that is looking at the antibody titers right now. Now, one of the challenges is because you have a liver affinity for the AAV virus, and you're delivering AAV vectors that are much higher in number than what you would be delivering in a child, there is a potential for T-cell mediated damage to the liver. And one of the things that we watch out for is hepatitis that may occur because of AAV that seems to respond to steroid. So we've been managed to control it quite well. So far, the preclinical results show that there is biochemical correction of glycogen accumulation in muscle and in the CNS, and there is reduction of cardiac hypertrophy, which are hallmarks of Pompe. There is functional improvement in skeletal and respiratory muscles, and it does seem to generate a lower immunogenicity than the native GA. It was a hypothesis generating data, and this is being tested in human trials right now. There are other approaches. You can directly deliver the gene to the muscle, and this was investigated in infantile Pompe through direct injections of the AAV vector into the diaphragm muscle, which is one of the muscles that gets affected, with a specific muscle-specific promoter, which is MHCK7 to target. I'm proud to say that one of our Pakistani medical alumni, Dr. Salim Aslam from Al Khan University, was the lead surgeon for this study at University of Florida. The other mechanism is to do intravenous IV delivery, where the AAV vector with a muscle-specific serotype and a muscle-specific promoter is delivered via IV, and they are given into the circulation and taken up by the muscle. The advantage here is the liver-directed AAV indirectly targets the muscle. Maybe only about 10% of the enzyme is actually getting into the muscle. But if you do a targeting of the local muscles, you get much better preclinical results. But again, this remains to be studied in a clinical trial. If you do intramuscular approach, especially, it is a very limited number of muscles that you can go after, and there may be increased transgene immunogenicity. The amount of the vectors that you have to give is also much higher than what you are doing with the liver thing. So there is a considerable potential for myositis and other conditions as well. Now, if you do an intravenous, you require a higher vector dose, which again increases the risk of producing anti-drug antibodies. But it is a systemic bathing of muscle tissue, of all muscle tissue, then rather than just specific muscles. The preclinical doses were smaller, so you required 1 to the 10 to the 14 or 3 to the 10 to the 14. And this in the preclinical mouse studies as well as primate studies did a great job of clearing lysosomal glycogen in the diaphragm, the heart, and the quadriceps muscle. That. And then the last strategy that I will talk about is the lentivirus approach, which AVROBIO is taking, which is hematopoietic stem cells. They're harvested from the patient blood. They're isolated in culture. They are transduced with lentivirus vectors, and copying a functional copy of the gene. And then they are harvested and cryopreserved and then returned back to the patient at some point. They are integrating viruses, so they will become permanent part of the DNA, and the transgene integrates into the chromosome of the patient. The reinfusion of the human stem cell has the potential to produce durable and stable expression, whereas with the adenovirus, there's always a potential for needing redosing, and we don't know what that when that redosing is going to be needed. In infantile diseases, we know that the kids have gone 7 years without requiring redose, but in adults, we don't know what that time would be. And there is evidence for CNS engraftment across blood-brain barrier using the lentivirus approach. The challenge here is that it must be optimized, and there is concern for insertional mutagenesis, so there can be cases of cancer associated with lentivirus. So again, to conclude the second part of this talk, the goal of gene transfer from Pompe disease is to provide stable trough levels of the GA enzyme in target tissues. The tissues can be targeted through selection of tissue-specific promoters or regulatory elements, and through choice of delivery methods, including IV and intramuscular routes, and also intraventricular or intrathecal route for Pompe disease. It is potentially a single-dose therapy that aims to provide endogenous, stable production of GAA, and at some point, they may require additional doses. And that's why I would like to talk about some of the issues currently related to gene therapy that has nothing to do with delivering the transgene. So as I mentioned, the AAV is a powerful platform. It can carry transgenes up to 5 kilobases. It has a low immunogenicity, but it has to be manufactured at a large scale, especially for adult population. There is a potential for cell-mediated killing of transduced cells, especially the hepatocytes. And we've already seen that in the gene therapy trials where the patients had to be treated with steroids. There is a potential for humoral immunity that develops to the vector capsid. And a lot of us already have these antibodies because the AAV is a common cold virus. And a lot of us, especially as we get older, get exposed to the AAV. And the size of the payload or the transgene that you can deliver is small. So both the innate and the adaptive immune system can react to the investigational AAV gene therapy. They can be neutralizing anti-capsid antibodies that will sort of neutralize the capsid, but they can also be anti-capsid CD8 T cells that may cause a cytotoxic immunity in this model. So there is both the adaptive immunity as well as innate immunity that is produced in response to AAV gene therapy. So the vector, before the vector is infused, it's possible that the patients may have anti-AAV antibodies. They may already have anti-AAV cytotoxic T cells, and they may have the anti-transgene antibodies. And that's why these patients have to be screened for anti-AAV antibodies. And if they have high titers of anti-AAV antibodies, currently they are not a candidate for gene therapy. Now, after hours after the vector infusion, the innate immunity may kick in. They can get a massive cytokine release. Dendritic cells can upregulate it, and other immune cells can be upregulated. And days to weeks after the vector infusion, they can develop adaptive immunity with anti-AAV antibodies, anti-AAV cytotoxic T cells, and anti-transgene antibodies that may be neutralizing. And this plays a role in the concept of redosing the patient in case the first dose of AAV gene therapy is starting to lose its effectiveness. So the humoral immunity poses a barrier to subject eligibility for access to AAV gene therapy, because if they happen to have AAV antibodies, they may have massive anaphylactic reaction, and they will develop antibodies to the vector. The AAV capsids are non-pathogenic, but they can induce an immune response. They are found in the nature. They generate, the immune system generates antibodies against these foreign but benign particles. And they have, individuals can have varying degrees of the neutralizing antibodies, and certain serotypes display a degree of cross-reactivity. So the seropositivity of the AAV virus is normally prevalent in human tissue, and this is a graph that's showing that up to 70% of individuals already have existing AAV antibodies. For AAV9 and AAV8, that's less. It's about 40 to 50%, but it's still a meaningful number. And then the neutralizing antibodies correlate with IgG levels, not IgM levels, and the antibodies cross-react between AAV serotypes. So if you have antibodies to AAV1, you may still have reaction to AAV8 and AAV9. And that's been the biggest challenge right now. In one of our Pompe studies, only about 50% of the patients were eligible for gene therapy because they had existing AAV antibodies. The concern there is that there is a potential for high vector neutralization, especially if you are giving systemic delivery or hepatic artery delivery or lymph perfusion, whereas the vector neutralization is less of an issue if there is CSF or intravitreal delivery. And then the antibodies are often an exclusion criteria because of potential for side effects and reaction. If they develop antibodies to the vector, even if they didn't have pre-existing immunity, the challenge would be re-administration if the patient ever requires re-administration. And this is a natural phenomena. We've seen this with other vectors, but most patients, once they are dosed, will develop antibodies to the AAV capsid after the infusion, and it seems to be dose dependent. So at least in the case of AAV1, AAV2, it is clearly dose dependent, less of a dose dependence in terms of AAV8. So people have been looking at various strategies to mitigate humoral immunity. It includes novel capsids, plasmapheresis, immunoadsorption, IgG inactivating drugs, and B-cell depletion therapy. And again, with the goal that we should be able to safely deliver AAV gene therapy, but also redose the patient if the dose should ever on that. So there are cysteine endopeptides that are being developed, which will finally cleave out the AAV vector from the transgene product and result in less antibody production. There are also strategies to reduce the T-cell immunity. So there are, as I mentioned, there may be T-cell mediated immunity to the hepatocyte, which can be life-threatening. So you can use corticosteroids, which is what we are using in the gene therapy trials right now. You can also put patient on cyclosporin or tacrolimus, or you can use rapamycin plus prednisone, or you can do rituximab, which is a B-cell ablation therapy. Again, you don't want to create more trouble for the patient. So the ideal immunomodulatory regimen for gene transfer must offer an acceptable risk-benefit profile. There has to be a clear evaluation of drug interactions independent of the gene therapy, and there has to be targeted and transient immunosuppression. So for instance, the corticosteroid therapy in gene therapy is only for 2 months, not for longer than that. And then in infantile Pompe disease, where they have very low levels of naturally occurring GAA, there is a very strong immune response against the drug, which is the GAA that occurs. These patients are usually negative for cross-reactive immunological material called CRIM, and the CRIM negative patients with infantile onset Pompe disease will very rapidly develop anti-GAA antibodies after receiving enzyme replacement, and these are neutralizing antibodies. They negate the effect of the enzyme. And these may develop in gene therapy as well, and that's one of the concerns there as well. Now, we know that liver-directed gene therapy has a potential advantage that it can induce tolerance to GA, so they are immunologically privileged. This occurs through the induction of transgene-specific Tregs. The intramuscular administration is associated with a higher transgene immunogenicity, and immunosuppression regimens can be used to reduce the development of humoral antibodies. So for instance, in clinical practice, in infantile onset Pompe disease, we treat them with immunosuppressants, including methotrexate and Rituxan, before they are started on enzyme replacement therapy. And as in anything in medicine, there has to be an equipoise where it has to be a balance between the immunity, but also the tolerance. You don't want to become too tolerant, but you also don't want to become too immune. So the key takeaway for this portion of the talk is that pre-existing and acquired humoral immunity to the vector, capsid, and construct can prevent viral uptake into the target cells. The cytotoxic T-cell responses that clear AV in transduced cells are currently managed with corticosteroids, but there may be other alternative methods. The immune response against the GA transgene product may occur, especially in CRIM-negative patients. And in the preclinical mouse models, liver-directed strategies have shown the potential to induce systemic tolerance to the transgene product through induction of antigen-specific regulatory T cells. I hope this helped you understand the challenges associated with gene therapy, the issues that we have to address before we can either dose a patient or, more importantly, redose the patient if the effects are wearing off. What are the different diseases where this strategy may be used? What are the current experiences with the approved gene therapy? And I just a overall summary of the logic behind gene therapy. I would be happy to take any questions and comments. Thank you once again for allowing me to participate in this program, and thank you for the invitation.